No, I understand you don't typically handle docking requests from civilians, I said, pinching the bridge of my nose. The late afternoon sun was warm on my face, a stark contrast to the ice water pumping through my veins. But this isn't a typical situation. This is a critical infrastructure failure impacting a level IV neonatal facility. Code Red, top priority. Do you have a pen? The project name is Operation Baby Flow. The silence on the other end of the line was thick with disbelief. I didn't care. Disbelief was a luxury I couldn't afford. From my vantage point on the grassy hill overlooking the pier, the city of Port North looked peaceful. Down below, however, a war was brewing. And I, Jack Sterling, recently laid off senior project manager and brand new father, was about to become its unlikeliest general. 12 hours earlier. The world, for the past 8 weeks, had shrunk to the size of a glass box. Inside that box, my son, Leo, was fighting for his life. He'd decided to make his grand entrance 2 months ahead of schedule, a 7-act play crammed into a 1-act running time. He was a beautiful, terrifyingly fragile little thing, all translucent skin and impossibly tiny fingers, hooked up to a symphony of machines that beeped and whirred the soundtrack of my anxiety. "He's a fighter, Mr. Sterling," Dr. Evans had told me, her eyes kind over her surgical mask. "He's got your stubborn jaw." I'd tried to smile. Let's hope he didn't get my credit score. She gave a tired laugh. The staff in the St. Mary's Hospital NICU were saints, every last one of them. They moved with a calm competence that bordered on supernatural, a stark contrast to the churning mess of fear and helplessness that had become my permanent state. My wife, Sarah, was at home, under strict doctor's orders to recover. That left me as the designated parent on duty, a role for which I felt profoundly unqualified. My entire career had been about managing risk, creating predictable outcomes from chaotic variables. But there was no Gantt chart for a premature baby. The variables were too small, the stakes too high. To cope, I'd channeled my nervous energy into building a new life. We'd just closed on a house in a community with a name that sounded like it was generated by an algorithm fed a diet of home and garden magazines, the Preserve at Waterside Commons. It was the suburban dream, or at least a convincing facsimile. The schools were supposed to be top tier. The parks were immaculate, and every blade of grass stood at attention, saluting the oppressive regime of perfection. The regime had a face, and her name was Carol Rask. My first, and until today only, interaction with Carol had been via a crisply folded letter left in my new HOA-approved mailbox. It was a violation notice. Not for loud parties, not for an unkempt lawn, but for our welcome mat. The mat, a cheerful little rectangle that said "Wipe your paws," was apparently woven from a non-compliant coir fiber blend. The approved blend, the letter helpfully informed me, was detailed in the HOA Charter, page 112, subsection C, paragraph 4. I'd read the letter, looked at the mat, and then tossed the letter in the recycling bin. I had a son in the NICU. The thread count of my welcome mat didn't exactly register on my list of priorities. I'd mentally filed Carol under minor annoyance, a human pop-up ad I could simply ignore. That was my first mistake. Underestimating a true believer is always a mistake. And Carol believed in the HOA Charter with the fire of a zealot. Back in the NICU, the first hint of trouble was a murmur among the nurses. "Water pressure's low again," one of them said, frowning at the sink in the hand-washing station. I didn't think much of it. Old building, old pipes. Then Dr. Evans found me, her usual professional calm replaced by a grim tension. "Jack," she began, forgoing the usual formalities. "We have a problem, a serious one." She explained the situation. The new wing of the hospital, the state-of-the-art pavilion that housed the NICU and other critical care units, bordered the preserve at Waterside Commons. In order to get the construction permits, the hospital had to agree to certain aesthetic covenants with the HOA. It was a deal with the devil they'd been forced to make. "It's the generator shed," she said, her voice laced with disbelief. "We had to build a sound-dampened shed for our new backup generator. We painted it hospital safety white. Carol Rask and the HOA board are insisting it should have been eggshell dream to match the community's trim color." I stared at her. "You're kidding me." "I wish I were," she sighed. "We've been going back and forth for weeks, lawyers, letters. We offered to repaint it, but now she's saying the structure itself violates a bylaw about detached utility buildings. She's been threatening to take action." "What kind of action?" I asked, a cold knot forming in my stomach. Dr. Evans looked towards the bank of incubators, towards my son. "The water main that supplies this wing of the hospital runs under a small strip of land that is technically an easement controlled by the HOA. She's been threatening to shut it off." The sheer, mind-boggling pettiness of it was staggering. It was like threatening to burn down an orphanage because you didn't like the color of their mailbox. "She wouldn't," I said, but the words sounded hollow even to me. "The hospital has a backup water tank," Dr. Evans continued, her voice low, "but it's designed for a catastrophic citywide failure. It'll only last us 24 hours, maybe less. The NICU alone, the sterile water for the humidifiers, the hand-washing protocols, the sanitation, we can't operate without it. The city says it's a private civil dispute and their hands are tied." As if on cue, a nurse at the far end of the room turned the handle on a faucet. A violent sputter of air and brown-tinged water coughed out, followed by a wheezing gasp. Then nothing. Silence. The only sounds were the rhythmic beeps of the monitors. The nurse looked up, her face a mask of shock. "The water's gone," she whispered. "It's completely off." Dr. Evans closed her eyes for a brief second. When she opened them, the look she gave me was one of pure, unadulterated desperation. They actually did it. That woman, she cut the water to the NICU. Something inside me snapped. All the fear, all the helplessness, all the sleepless nights spent staring at ceilings and praying to a God I wasn't sure I believed in. It all coalesced into a single, diamond-hard point of focus. I looked at the glass box where my son slept, oblivious. The beeping of his heart monitor was a clock, a ticking clock. The laid-off project manager, the guy who lived and breathed timelines and deliverables, woke from his slumber. The world ceased to be a terrifying, emotional vortex. It became a project, a problem with a solution. I pulled out my phone, my fingers flying across the screen. I walked out of the NICU, past the stunned nurses and the grim-faced doctor, my stride filled with a purpose I hadn't felt in months. The objective was clear. The deadline was non-negotiable. The antagonist had been identified. It was time for a project kickoff. The hospital cafeteria was a hive of controlled panic. Doctors huddled in corners, speaking in low, urgent tones. Nurses rushed by, their faces etched with worry. I found an empty table, flipped open my laptop, and created a new file. The muscle memory was comforting. In the chaos of my life, this was the one thing I knew how to do. Project title, Operation, Unkaren the Water Supply. Finalized title, Operation, Baby Flow. Better for stakeholder buy-in. Primary objective, restore critical water supply, H2O, to the St. Mary's NICU. Timeline, 18 hours maximum, allowing for a 6-hour buffer before the hospital's backup tank ran dry. Key stakeholders and analysis. Carol Rask, antagonist/obstacle. Motivated by pathological rule following. unlikely to respond to reason. Direct confrontation is inefficient. Must be circumvented. Hospital administration. Client. Currently ineffective, bogged down in legal procedure. Cannot be relied upon for swift action. City Water Department. Roadblock. Classic bureaucratic bottleneck. Will cite regulations and pass responsibility. Avoid if possible. Dr. Evans, end-user ally. On-site asset. Can provide real-time updates on critical needs. Leo Sterling, primary beneficiary. The ultimate deliverable. Project failure is not an option. My fingers paused over the keyboard. A normal person would call the police again, or maybe a news station. But I wasn't a normal person anymore. I was a project manager. And a project manager knows that when the front door is locked, you don't keep knocking. You find a window, a back door, or, if necessary, you start analyzing the load-bearing capacity of the walls. My first call was to my best friend, Dave Chen. Dave was a civil engineer for the Port North Authority, a man whose life was a series of stress-induced sighs and complaints about seagulls. He was also one of the most competent people I knew. He answered on the third ring. "Jack, everything okay? How's the little guy?" "Leo's a fighter, Dave, but listen, I need a favor. A big one." I lowered my voice. "I need water, a lot of it, delivered to St. Mary's Hospital." "Like a water truck?" Dave asked, his voice cautious. "I can call the city depot, but they're always swamped with main breaks and stuff. It could take days." "A truck's not going to cut it, Dave," I said, pacing by the cafeteria window. I could see the harbor from here, glittering in the distance. The hospital's intake is a 12-inch main. A tanker truck is like trying to fill a swimming pool with a Dixie cup. I need something bigger, something with its own industrial-grade pumps, something that can sit in the harbor and push water a quarter-mile inland. I paused for effect. "You guys have ships, right? What's the biggest water tanker you've got access to?" The silence on the other end was profound. I could almost hear the gears grinding in Dave's engineering brain. "A water tanker?" he finally squeaked. "Jack, we're a container port, not a floating aqueduct. We move sneakers and cheap electronics, not municipal utilities. The only things we deal with that have that kind of onboard capacity and pumping power are, well..." He trailed off. "Go on," I prompted, a wild, beautiful, utterly insane idea beginning to blossom in my mind. "They're Navy ships, Jack," he said, his voice a whisper. "We have a Fleet Week agreement, joint emergency response drills. There's the USNS Mercy, the hospital ship. It sometimes does PR tours and training exercises out of here. It has its own desalination plants, massive water stores, hospital-grade purification systems." Bingo. The idea bloomed from a blossom into a full-blown sequoia of beautiful stupidity. It was perfect. It was elegant. It was completely, certifiably insane. "The Mercy," I said, my voice full of newfound reverence. "Perfect. Who's the contact for that?" "Whoa, whoa, whoa," Dave yelped, his voice cracking. "Hold on. You can't just call the Navy and ask for a hospital ship. That's not how it works, Jack. There are protocols. There are requests from FEMA, congressional-level approvals, declarations of national emergency. You can't just order one up like a pizza." "Dave," I said, my voice dropping to a low, serious tone. "My son is hooked up to a machine that needs water yesterday. Bureaucracy is just a series of locked doors. The trick isn't to knock on all of them. It's to find the one guy who has the master key." My project manager brain was flying now, risk matrices and communication plans unfolding in my head. "Give me the number for the Fleet Week liaison office. Now." He argued for another 30 seconds, but he knew I wouldn't back down. Defeated, he texted me the number. I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and dialed. This was it, the point of no return. A bored-sounding petty officer answered the phone. "Fleet Logistics. This is Petty Officer Evans. Time to go to work." I shifted my language, adopting the confident, jargon-laden drone I used to use when briefing executives. "Petty Officer, this is Jack Sterling, on-site coordinator for a critical incident in Port North," I began, my voice crisp and authoritative. "I'm reporting a critical municipal infrastructure failure directly impacting a Level IV neonatal care facility. We have a cascading system collapse imminent, and I'm formally requesting immediate logistical support under the Emergency Management Assistance Compact, Section 2A. I made all of that up, but it sounded good. The petty officer was silent for a beat. Sir, this line is usually for scheduling ship tours." "I understand, son," I said, cutting him off gently but firmly. "But we're past the scheduling phase. We are in an active humanitarian crisis situation. I need to be escalated to your commanding officer for an immediate asset allocation review. The project name is Operation Baby Flow." The jargon was my weapon. The military, like any large corporation, runs on acronyms and official-sounding terminology. Confidence is currency. He didn't know what Operation Baby Flow was, but it sounded official as hell. Okay, sir, please hold." The line clicked. The tinny, jaunty strains of Anchors Away began to play. I looked out the cafeteria window at the distant, sparkling water of the harbor. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the calm, steady beeping of the machines in the NICU upstairs. "Okay," I muttered to myself, a grim smile spreading across my face. Phase 1, feasibility study complete. Now for Phase 2, procurement. Victory in the mind of Carol Rask was a quiet, tidy thing. It tasted like weak tea and smelled like potpourri. From her beige-on-beige living room, she gazed out at the offending white generator shed of St. Mary's Hospital. The plumber she'd hired, a cousin of a friend from her bridge club, had confirmed the job was done. The valve was turned. The message was sent. The rules, after all, were the rules. They were the thin beige line between civilization and chaos. Her moment of serene triumph was shattered by the shrill ring of her cordless phone. It was Martha, from 2 houses down. "Carol, you need to come down to the front gate right now," Martha hissed, her voice a frantic whisper. "There's a man! I think he's trying to dig a trench in the petunia bed." Carol's blood ran cold. The petunias were a source of great community pride. This was an act of war. By the time I was on the phone with a bewildered official from the city planning department, arguing about public right-of-way versus private easements, the cavalry had arrived. 2 black and white police cruisers, lights off, glided to a stop by the manicured entrance to the preserve. Out stepped 2 officers. The first was older, with a mustache that had seen things and a weary slump to his shoulders that suggested he'd seen it all twice. His name tag read Miller. The second was younger, sharper, with an eager, by-the-book look on his face. Garcia. And there, standing beside the HOA's ridiculously ornate welcome sign, was Carol Rask. Her arm was outstretched, her finger trembling as she pointed it directly at me. I was holding a can of inverted orange spray paint, having just marked a graceful arc across a patch of perfectly green lawn. "That's him, officer!" she squawked, her voice a clarion call of suburban outrage. "He threatened me. He trespassed on our common ground. He said he was going to bring a warship to my front door." Officer Miller approached me with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who was already halfway through his shift in his head. "Okay, sir. Let's all just take a breath. What's going on here? Did you threaten this woman?" I clicked the cap back on my spray paint and faced him, keeping my demeanor as calm and professional as possible. "Officer, good afternoon. To answer your question, no, I did not threaten her. I simply informed her of the logistical necessities of my current project." I gestured vaguely towards the hospital. "She is the individual who has, by her own admission, illegally terminated the water supply to a critical care facility, endangering the lives of multiple newborns. I am simply implementing a contingency plan." Officer Garcia, the younger one, frowned. "A contingency plan, sir? You're standing in a flower bed with a can of spray paint." "I'm marking the optimal route for the temporary water conduit," I explained patiently. "It minimizes disruption to the local flora and follows the natural gradient of the terrain. Standard procedure." Miller sighed, a deep, world-weary sound. He looked from me to the apoplectic Carol and back again. He was clearly seconds away from arresting me for public nuisance, just to make the paperwork simpler. It was time to play my ace. While on hold with the Navy, listening to the 4th rotation of Anchors Aweigh, my frantic thumb typing had unearthed a gem, a beautiful, archaic, and likely forgotten piece of local legislation. "Actually, officers," I said, my voice taking on a new layer of confidence, "I believe you'll find my actions are protected under the City Charter of Port North, 1887 revision. Section 9, paragraph 4, to be specific. It states, and I quote, 'In the event of a dire public health emergency, any citizen has the right to commandeer private or public resources necessary to preserve life, should the municipal government fail to act within 1 hour of notification.'" I let that hang in the air. I logged my official notification with the City Water Department an hour and 27 minutes ago. My lawyer has a time-stamped copy of the call log. I didn't have a lawyer. My lawyer was a screenshot on my phone, but I said it with the unshakable conviction of a man who had a whole firm on speed dial. Miller and Garcia exchanged a look. They were cops, not 19th century legal scholars. They had no idea if I was telling the truth, but the sheer specificity of my claim gave them pause. The bureaucratic mind fears nothing more than an obscure, unverified rule that could come back to haunt them. As they were processing this, my phone rang. The caller ID was a blocked number. I knew who it was. I held up a finger, a silent 1 moment, and answered, putting the call on speaker. A voice, crisp and powerful, and imbued with the kind of authority that can launch fighter jets, boomed from the tiny speaker. It was a voice that didn't know what weak tea tasted like. "This is Rear Admiral Fletcher, Naval Medical Command, Pacific Fleet. Am I speaking with the designated on-site coordinator for Operation Baby Flow?" Time seemed to stop. A bird chirped in a nearby HOA compliant tree. Officer Miller's mustache twitched. Officer Garcia's jaw went slack. Carol Rask looked like she'd been struck by lightning. I cleared my throat. "Admiral, yes, Jack Sterling speaking. Good to hear from you. We're on schedule. Do we have an ETA on that asset?" "The USNS Mercy is breaking from training exercises and can be at your designated pier in 6 hours. The Admiral's voice crackled. There was a pause. "I have to say, Mr. Sterling, this is the most irregular request I have ever fielded in my 30 years of service. My aide tells me you navigated 4 separate departmental phone trees in under 7 minutes. Is that correct?" "I had a strong motivating factor, sir," I said simply. 6 hours, excellent. We'll be ready on our end." "Very well. Fletcher out." The line went dead. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and gave the 2 police officers a polite, professional smile. Carol was still frozen, her mouth a perfect O of horrified disbelief. "Now," I said, picking up my can of spray paint, "as I was saying about that trench." Officer Miller just stared at me for a long moment. Then he slowly shook his head, a gesture that encompassed all the absurdity of his day, his job, and possibly his life. He turned and walked back to his patrol car. "Garcia," he called over his shoulder. "Forget the paperwork, we're on traffic control. A 70,000-ton, state-of-the-art naval hospital ship was on its way." This was a significant project milestone. However, my project plan had a glaring hole in the execution phase. A ship full of water is useless if you can't get the water out of the ship and into the building. I needed plumbers. But I didn't need the kind of plumber you call for a leaky faucet. I didn't need a guy with a van and a snake drain. I needed a specialist. I needed someone who looked at a 12-inch industrial water main the way a neurosurgeon looks at a brainstem. Someone who wouldn't be fazed by a request that sounded like the setup to a very strange joke. I pulled out my phone, my fingers flying over the search bar. Emergency Industrial Plumbing Marine Port North. Most of the results were for standard commercial outfits. But one, nestled at the bottom of the page, caught my eye. It was less a business listing and more a declaration of philosophy. "Sully's Emergency Plumbing and Marine Services. If it's wet and it's weird, we're there." This was my guy. I dialed the number. A voice that sounded like it was filtered through gravel, and 50 years of cheap cigars answered on the first ring. "Sully's." "Hi, my name is Jack Sterling," I said, trying to sound as credible as possible. "I have an emergency plumbing job. It's a bit unusual." A gruff chuckle came down the line. "Kid, last week I had to retrieve a guy's toupee from the bilge pump of a fishing trawler. The week before that, it was a wedding ring from the septic tank of a shrimp boat. The word unusual stopped meaning anything to me around 1988. Try me." "Okay." I took a breath. "I need to run a temporary 12-inch high-pressure water main from a ship docked at Pier 4 to the primary intake valve at St. Mary's Hospital. It's about a quarter-mile run, mostly over municipal grassland." There was a long, heavy pause on the other end. I could hear the faint sound of a television playing a game show in the background. "What kind of ship?" Sully finally asked, his voice flat. "A Mercy-class hospital ship," I said. "United States Navy." Another pause. This one even longer. I was worried he'd hung up. "Is this a prank call?" he asked, but there was a flicker of professional curiosity in his tone. "Because if it is, it's a damn original one." "Sir," I said, my voice earnest, "I assure you this is not a prank. The water has been cut to the hospital's neonatal intensive care unit. I have federal authorization and the cooperation of the local police. I can pay you double your standard emergency rate, in cash." The mention of cash, federal authorization, and the NICU seemed to be the magic combination. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Sully grunted, "and I'm bringing the big pipe." 20 minutes later, a flatbed truck that looked like it had survived a war rumbled to a stop beside me. It was laden with massive coiled sections of flexible blue pipe, industrial-sized valves, and a small, greasy-looking crane. The man who hopped out of the driver's seat was Sully. He was a man in his late 60s, with a sun-beaten face that looked like a road map of every back road in the state, and hands the size of baseball mitts. He took one look at my orange spray-painted line on the grass, then craned his neck to look at the hospital, then squinted towards the pier. He looked back at me, chewing on an unlit cigar butt. "You're nuts, kid," he said, a slow grin spreading across his face. "I like it. Let's get to work." What followed was a masterclass in controlled chaos, a beautiful, absurd ballet of blue-collar competence. Sully and his two-man crew, a pair of equally grizzled men named Pete and Mac, worked with a silent, efficient rhythm born of decades of solving impossible problems. The crane whirred to life, lifting the huge sections of pipe. They laid the conduit along my orange line with a shocking disregard for the pristine, HOA-mandated turf. Officer Garcia, looking deeply uncomfortable, was reluctantly holding back a growing crowd of bewildered onlookers and directing traffic away from the entrance to the preserve. Officer Miller had reclined the seat in his patrol car, a half-eaten donut resting on his dashboard, watching the scene unfold with an expression of profound resignation. It was clear he had decided to just ride this wave of insanity wherever it took him. Hospital staff, their faces pressed against the windows, watched the proceedings with a mixture of hope and sheer disbelief. And Carol Rask, my God, Carol. She was a hurricane of fury, running back and forth from the police cars to the work crew, waving her HOA charter like a mad prophet. She was trying to find a single person in a position of authority who would listen to her, but no one would. The city officials were either terrified of the phrase federal operation or too deeply confused to act. The cops were ignoring her. Sully and his crew just looked right through her. I was the calm center of the storm. My phone was permanently attached to my ear as I paced the perimeter. 1 minute I was coordinating with a very stressed-out Dave at the harbor master's office. "Dave, just clear the berth. Tell the tugboat captains it's a national security drill. Improvise." The next I was giving a progress report to Dr. Evans. "We're laying the final section now. Estimated time to connection is under an hour." Finally, Sully wiped his greasy hands on a rag and gave me a thumbs up. He and his crew had wrestled the final section of the massive blue pipe up to the hospital's main intake valve, a big red wheel on the side of the building. "She's ready to connect, kid," Sully grunted, nodding towards the pier. "All we need now is a boat." As if summoned by his words, we heard it. A deep, powerful, soul-shaking horn blast echoed from the harbor entrance. It wasn't a ferry horn or a container ship horn. It was the sound of authority. I turned and looked towards the water. And there it was. A vision in white. A vessel so large it seemed to bend the horizon around it, gliding silently and majestically into the channel. A giant red cross painted on its hull was the USNS Mercy. The sun glinted off its superstructure. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. The arrival of the USNS Mercy wasn't just an event. It was a spectacle that brought the entire waterfront to a standstill. It slid into the port with the quiet, inexorable grace of a glacier, dwarfing the container ships and fishing boats. It didn't just occupy the pier, it consumed it. Crowds were gathering along the railings, their cell phones held aloft. A local news helicopter, a buzzing insect in the sky, circled overhead, capturing the surreal scene. Down on Pier 4, my friend Dave Chen looked like a man on the verge of a complete nervous breakdown. His Port Authority jacket was zipped up to his chin despite the warm afternoon, and he was power walking in tight circles, screaming into a walkie-talkie at the tugboat captains who were nudging the colossal ship into its berth. I jogged up and clapped him on the shoulder, probably a little too cheerfully. "Looking good, Dave. Nice and smooth, see? Told you it was possible." Dave spun around, his eyes wide with terror. "Smooth? Jack, are you insane? The Admiral is on this ship. Rear Admiral Fletcher, the actual Admiral. He wants to have a word with the on-site coordinator. That's you, Jack, you. I'm going to lose my job, my pension. I'm going to be blacklisted from every port on the eastern seaboard. I'll be lucky if I can get a job swabbing the deck on a booze cruise." "Nonsense," I said soothingly, channeling the calm I absolutely did not feel. "We're solving a problem. People get promoted for solving problems. You're demonstrating interagency cooperation in a crisis. Frame it that way on your resume." Before Dave could have the aneurysm he was clearly working towards, it was time for the final act of our little drama. Sully and his crew were down by the water's edge, ready to connect our big blue hose to the ship's outlet valve. But just as they were maneuvering the heavy coupling into place, a figure of pure, unadulterated fury marched onto the pier. It was Carol. She was making her last stand. She strode past the police barricade, which Officer Garcia was too stunned to enforce, and brandished a dog-eared copy of the HOA bylaws like a weapon. "Stop this! Stop this right now!" she shrieked, her voice cutting through the air. "This is a flagrant violation of the Preserve at Waterside Commons Charter, Section 14, Subsection B. No temporary structures, including but not limited to hoses, pipes, or conduits, may be placed on common ground without a majority vote from the Architectural Review Committee." I was about to deliver a carefully prepared monologue about necessity and the greater good, but I never got the chance. A shadow fell over us. From the gangplank that had just been lowered from the Mercy, a figure descended. He was tall and ramrod straight, his crisp white uniform blazing in the sun. Medals glittered on his chest. He was flanked by 2 United States Marines in full-dress uniform, their faces impassive and their presence utterly intimidating. It was Rear Admiral Fletcher. He walked down the gangplank with unhurried purpose. He walked right past me, past Sully, past the gawking cops, and stopped directly in front of Carol Rask. He was a foot taller than her, and radiated an aura of command so powerful it felt like a physical force. He looked down at the sheaf of papers in her trembling hand. His voice was quiet, but it carried with absolute clarity. "Ma'am," he said, "am I to understand that this is your signature on the work order that authorized the closure of the primary water main supplying St. Mary's Hospital?" Carol's friend from the bridge club, it turned out, had a conscience. Faced with the reality of what he'd helped her do, the plumber had called the city and confessed everything, a fact the Admiral's aide had relayed to him en route. Carol faltered, her righteous anger wilting under his gaze. It was within the rights of the Homeowners Association." Admiral Fletcher didn't even blink. "Ma'am, that water main also supplies the fire hydrant system for this entire waterfront district, including this pier. By shutting it down without municipal or federal approval, you have violated Title 18 of the U.S. Code, Section 1366, willful destruction of a national defense utility. Furthermore, as this port is a designated naval support facility in times of crisis, your actions could be interpreted as impeding military readiness." He gestured slightly with his chin towards the 2 stoic Marines. "These young men would be happy to explain the full legal and jurisdictional ramifications to you, in a secure room, for several hours." The color drained from Carol's face. She turned a shade of white that almost matched the ship's hull. The HOA bylaws slipped from her fingers and fluttered to the ground. The Admiral then turned his attention to me. For a moment he just looked at me, his eyes sharp and analytical, as if he were trying to solve a complex equation. "Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice a low rumble, "I've read your file, or what little my aide could piece together in the last few hours. Laid off from Omnicorp Project Management a month ago. Top of your class at MIT Sloan. You managed to accomplish in 3 hours with a cellular telephone what would have taken my staff 3 weeks, 2 acts of Congress, and a presidential decree." He paused. "You are either the biggest idiot I have ever had the misfortune of encountering, or the most audacious genius." I swallowed hard. "I'm just a dad, sir." A long moment passed. Then the corner of the Admiral's mouth twitched. A slow, grudging smile spread across his face. He'd made his decision. He turned to Sully. "Connect the hose, mister." "Aye, aye, Admiral," Sully grunted, snapping a mock salute. With a final heave, Sully's crew wrenched the massive coupling into place and tightened the bolts. He gave me a greasy thumbs up. I pulled out my phone and hit Dr. Evans's number on speed dial. "Get ready," I said into the phone. We're live in 5. I hung up and nodded to the Admiral. He raised a handheld radio to his mouth, his gaze fixed on the hospital in the distance. "Bridge," he commanded, his voice booming with authority. "This is Fletcher. Open the auxiliary pump valve. Full operational pressure." A deep, powerful thrum vibrated up from the pier, a sleeping giant awakening within the ship's hull. The big blue hose, which had been lying flaccid on the grass, suddenly stiffened and swelled, a massive artery coming to life. It pulsed once, twice, as thousands of gallons of purified, life-giving water began its quarter-mile journey. From the windows of the hospital, a sound began to swell. It was faint at first, then grew louder. It was a cheer. My phone buzzed in my hand. I looked down. It was a text from Dr. Evans. The text contained a single photo: the stainless steel sink in the NICU, with a powerful, crystal-clear stream of water gushing from the faucet. The caption underneath read, "We have flow. Leo says thank you." I leaned against a pier pylon, the roar of the crowd and the thrum of the pump fading into the background. And for the first time in 8 weeks, I finally let out the breath I had been holding. The next morning I was famous. Or infamous, depending on which cable news channel you watched. The headline on the local station's website was my favorite. "Suburban Dad Hijacks Navy to Save Babies. HOA President Under Federal Investigation." I was sitting in the same hospital cafeteria, which was now buzzing with a celebratory energy. A young, earnest reporter from Channel 4 News was interviewing me, her microphone held out like a holy relic. "So, Mr. Sterling?" she said, her eyes wide with a mixture of admiration and confusion. "Can you walk us through your thought process? When you learned the water was cut, what made you think I should call the U.S. Navy?" I took a sip of the terrible cafeteria coffee. "It was a simple matter of resource allocation and supply chain logistics," I said deadpan. "The primary vendor failed to deliver, so I sourced a new vendor with a proven track record of large-scale crisis management. It was the most efficient path to a solution." The reporter just blinked, scribbling furiously in her notepad. In the background, I could see Officers Miller and Garcia being interviewed by another crew. Miller, looking deeply uncomfortable in the limelight, was being hailed as a hero for his calm and decisive crisis coordination. He kept shrugging and saying, "I just made sure the truck didn't run over the hose." Garcia was proudly explaining the intricacies of creating a temporary traffic diversion. They were the unsung heroes of the operation's tactical deployment. My interview was interrupted by a familiar, authoritative presence. Rear Admiral Fletcher, now in his regular service khakis, stood beside our table. The reporter nearly swallowed her microphone. "If you'll excuse us," the Admiral said to her. It wasn't a request. The reporter scrambled away. The Admiral sat down opposite me. "Sterling," he began, getting straight to the point. "That was the most impressive display of logistical improvisation and bureaucratic warfare I have ever witnessed. You have a very particular set of skills." "It's mostly for managing software rollouts," I said. "The Navy has a civilian logistics and support division," he continued, ignoring my comment. "We call it the Military Sealift Command. It's filled with people who move mountains of equipment and supplies across the globe. It's mostly paperwork and navigating procurement regulations, but the pay is good and the problems are big." He slid a business card across the table. "We could use a man who can cut through red tape like you do. Think about it." I looked at the card. Rear Admiral James Fletcher, with the seal of the Department of the Navy. I tucked it into my pocket. "I'll think about it, Admiral," I said honestly. "But I have a project at home that needs my full attention for a little while." He nodded, understanding. "Your son?" "And a welcome mat to purchase," I added. "A compliant one." He actually chuckled at that, a deep, rumbling sound. "I read the report on that. Good luck, son." Later that day, I received an email with the subject line, "An urgent message from the Preserve at Waterside Commons HOA Board." With some trepidation, I opened it. It was a notification. Carol Rask had resigned as president, effective immediately, citing pressing health and legal reasons. The remaining board members had held an emergency vote. They had unanimously voted to cede the small parcel of land the generator shed was on directly to the hospital as a goodwill gesture to our community partners. They had also voted to make hospital safety white, an officially approved accent color in the community charter. The final line of the email was the sweetest victory of all. Furthermore, upon review, your welcome mat has been retroactively approved and is considered to be in full compliance. We apologize for any inconvenience. A few weeks drifted by. The national news cycle moved on. The USNS Mercy was long gone, back to its training exercises in the vast Pacific. The trench Sully and his crew had carved through the common ground had been perfectly refilled and resodded by a grateful city parks department, who had also installed a permanent underground water line to the new hospital wing in a fit of profound public embarrassment. The city charter of 1887 was now undergoing a full legal review. The beeps and whirs of the NICU had faded from my life. They were replaced by new sounds: the soft gurgle of a baby sleeping, the rustle of diapers, the off-key lullabies sung by a tired but happy father. Today was the day. Dr. Evans met us at the NICU doors, a wide, genuine smile on her face. "He's ready, Jack," she said, looking at the bundle in my arms. "He aced his final exams." I was buckling Leo into a car seat for the very first time. My hands, which had confidently dialed admirals and hired contractors, trembled as I tried to figure out the 5-point harness. This was when infinitely more complex and terrifying. As I drove slowly out of the hospital parking lot, my precious cargo secure in the back, I passed the infamous generator shed. It was still a crisp, defiant white. Someone, and I had a strong suspicion it was Sully, had stenciled a small, neat logo on the side of it. It was a drawing of a baby bottle nestled safely inside a naval anchor. Underneath it, in clean block letters, were the words, "Operation Baby Flow, completed." I looked in the rearview mirror. Leo was fast asleep, his tiny chest rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm. The world was quiet. The war was over. We were going home. Project complete, I thought, a smile finally reaching my own tired face. And this one was the only one that ever really mattered.